The way you can tell an overclocker mostly designed a case, this one, is that it has holes everywhere. One Mr. Der8 auer designed this case in conjunction with Lian Li. We looked at it at CES 2018 and we're actually very impressed with it. I think we gave it one of our awards for the show. So this is the Lian Li O11 Dynamic. It also has an O11 Air coming out in May or June, and the Dynamic is where we're starting today for a review, and we were able to air cool it anyway. So we're going to look at this one and see how an extreme overclocker's case holds up to our thermal battery. Before that, this video is brought to you by the EVGA Z10 mechanical keyboard. The EVGA Z10 includes a small display readout top and center, capable of providing hardware monitoring information and EVGA precision statistics. The board comes with either pale brown or blue switches, offers a column of programmable macro keys, a volume slider, a dimmer, and a detachable wrist rest. Learn more at the link in the description below. Quick note, getting started into this, all of our lights are plugged into a battery backup right now because the electricity's out. So the lighting may be a little bit different from normally, but whatever. Point is, we're looking at the O11 Dynamic today. The O11 Air is the one that I'm really interested in. It has a mesh, or a grill rather, in the front, and I believe the top that we saw at CES 2018. This is more meant for water cooling builds, so it's called the Dynamic. It comes with 0 fans. It's $130 MSRP. It's $100 pre-order. By the time this goes live, pre-order's over, so it's $130 case, made by Lian Li, which for them is quite cheap, in cooperation with Der8 auer and Extreme Overclocker, who put in a lot of the legwork designing the case. There are some pretty good features on it that we'll get to. First off, though, for cooling support, so up front of it's glass, side's glass. Fortunately, there are still holes in the case. The bottom has support for 3 120mm fans. Lian Li sent 9 of them, I guess just to make sure we used fans and didn't test it stock with no fans. And the left side here has space for a 360 radiator as well, or 3 120mm fans. Top has space for 3 120mm fans as well. The back cannot support a fan technically. You could get an 80mm in there if you wanted to and kind of forcefully mount it. But basically, it's up to your own decisions to figure out how you're going to cool the thing. We tested a few different configurations. One of them was all 3 fans on the bottom. We budgeted ourselves to 3 fans for all of the thermal testing because basically we looked at it as, well, it's a $130 case. Maybe you buy a minimum of $30 worth of fans if you're spending this kind of money on a case. So if you do that, it puts you at about 3 fans for kind of the mid-range to cheap stuff. So we went with 3 fans for our budget for thermal testing because it's unreasonable to test everything. Tried 3 in the bottom, 3 in the side. We tried 2 in the bottom, 1 on the top, all intake. We tried 1 in the bottom, 1 on the side, intake, and then 1 on the top, exhaust. Lots of different things. This case is actually really cool from a, not necessarily thermally, but from a test perspective because it gave us some unique insights that we don't normally see with other cases. But let's go through the build quality and the feature set. One of the first things we noticed is that when you remove the top panel here, which is 2 screws as usually for a panel, what you end up with is just a simple press to get the glass out. And this is actually really cool, and it's kind of sad that it's really cool because so many companies can't figure out how to mount tempered glass in a way that's not ugly or really poorly designed from a UX, UI, UX, I guess, scenario. So glass is super easy to remove. That's really nice. They use basically just studs that mount into a socket. So it's a round peg that goes into a socket. Same's true for this panel and for the front panel as well. So you just kind of push it, comes off, no screws. And it's not like that's gonna make your cooling better or anything, but functionally, it's really well designed, build quality is good, and they clearly thought it out pretty well. There are a few things where you can see decision points in the case too. For example, in the back, Lian Li is a couple of millimeters away from being able to support a 120mm fan. So you know, hopefully anyway, at some point in the design process, someone said, should we make this thing a little wider and support a 120? And ultimately they decided no. They wanted a specific size, semi-compact case without getting into the ultra-wide Corsair style double wide trailer case that we've seen in the past. So that's what they went with there. For other features, I guess I'll pop the glass off too just to show that's the same mechanism. So my only complaint with all the popping panels is that with the glass, it's impossible to do it without getting smudges on it. I don't know that there's a better solution to that, but be prepared to clean it off. All right, so that's the bare case. Internally, what we have is a standard layout. It supports ATX motherboards and water cooling, obviously, so you can kind of mount the radiators wherever you want. For the things like cable management, this motherboard tray comes out really far. It's super deep. The reason is because there are 2 power supply mounts behind the motherboard tray, so it's compartmentalized. And the second power supply mount does not have to be used. We're not using it presently. It's basically there in case you, for some reason, maybe you're pushing enough current that you need 2 power supplies. Pretty rare use case, exceptionally rare, because you can't put 2 computers in here. So it would just be if you need 2 power supplies for 1 computer, which sounds like the kind of thing Der8auer would need. Sounds like the kind of thing he said, no guys, I promise, people really want this, because he really wants it. So anyway, you're probably not going to use it. Alternatively, it does have a drive cage instead for the second power supply. You can pull that, move it into either cage, power supply slot, and then put the power supply whichever one you want. Well designed there, and one of the features that, although probably unused in 99% of use cases, is a unique one. There's a giant cable management bar on the back. Now, technically, they have cable tie-down points all over the backside. You could properly route and tie down the cables in the back, or you just smash it all down with the cable management bar. So that was well done and implemented. The fan options we liked a lot and had pretty unique cooling performance as noted, but it does come down to the air for what we want to see on the benches. Visually, this one is one of the better tempered glass implementations we've seen. They've managed to put the glass on without screws sticking out. They've managed to do it without really annoying tool requirements like flathead screwdrivers and Allen keys, XOCer and Cooler Master. And also the fact that they come to a sort of flush finish at the end makes it look more like a showroom case. Actually, we think it looks better in this stock configuration than it did at CES with their case mod configuration. It was a very cool mod. Props to the person who made it, but the stock configuration looks good on its own because it shows off the components so well. So, other notes, vertical GPU placement is something we noticed as soon as we saw the case. There are multiple slots for the vertically oriented GPU to be mounted, and all of them are set well away from the glass, unlike other cases that tend to suffocate air-cooled GPUs by smushing them against the side panel. The mounting kit that shipped with our case is slightly different than the one depicted in the instruction manual. It seems like one that Lian Li is trying to use for future case designs so that they can reduce their tooling cost later. The expansion slot nearest the motherboard is impossible to use with an ATX board because of clearance issues, and there are mounting holes for the riser cable that don't correspond to any PCIe slots. They're too far forward towards the glass. Still, we didn't have any problems fitting our extra wide MSI 1080 in there, and the 2 PCIe slots nearest the glass, the ones we used for testing, still offer much more GPU clearance than other cases we've seen. We'll put the test bench up on the screen briefly. This is what we use for standardized airflow testing and thermals. The case is meant for liquid cooling, but it still is something you could easily buy for an air-cooled case. It's got plenty of fan mounting points. It doesn't have to be used for water cooling just because it has glass. In fact, most of the other cases on the market would indicate that anyway. So we have plenty of side intake options. We have plenty of bottom, top intake or exhaust options, which makes it pretty unique to test. Our configurations for this would be, first of all, we used the fans Lian Li sent, 3 of these. We figured probably people will be buying these. And to be fair, it's what they're sending out with the Air later anyways. This gives us some early insight and will make it easier for us to compare this case versus the Air version of the case later. So we use these fans. We put 3 in the side intake. All 3 of them blow air straight in. They hit the glass, make a U-turn basically. You lose some pressure every time you make a 90-degree turn. You lose about 30% of your pressure. So the air comes in, makes a turn, and it gets pulled through the CPU tower, gets pulled through the video card. There's not a lot of place for it to exhaust, except naturally based on just air pressure. You end up with a positive intake pressure, so that would dictate that the air finds its way out through gaps naturally. That would be gaps in the bottom, the back, and the top. Our other configuration was 3 fans in the bottom blowing straight up. Those are largely obstructed by the video card, and so the CPU would perform worse in that scenario. And then finally, or actually the 2 final ones, we had 2 in the bottom, both pushing straight up into the GPU, removing the one that was pushing air into the rest of the cabin. And then we had 1 in the top right in front of the CPU as intake, pulling air down. And then after that, we did 1 more with a side intake, a bottom intake, and a top exhaust because it's a unique case, so we wanted to test all of those. Let's get into the thermal and noise numbers next. and then talk about the results. One more note for the thermal testing before we get into it. These fans spin really fast, 1900 RPM, which puts us at total system noise of 48 dBA when everything's going. And because of that, it's quite a bit louder than everything else on the chart, even though we always test everything with max fan speeds unless otherwise stated. So we did 100% speeds for comparative numbers with the Lian Li O11 Dynamic by itself. And then we did a 40 dBA noise normalized set of numbers for something that's toward the top end in terms of noise of all the other cases. This gives us more comparative data because it sort of levels the playing field in terms of noise or loudness, as opposed to just blasting at the loudest possible configuration and instantly winning all charts. Starting with standalone torture thermals on the CPU, the Lian Li O11 Dynamic, configured for air cooling, posts a wide range of results, from 49 degrees to 67 degrees Celsius over ambient. Except for 40 dBA testing, all the other tests were at 100% fan speeds strictly for fan placement comparisons. We found that the 3 side panel intake fans perform the best with a 49 degree over ambient CPU result, which is closest followed by side intake fans at 40 dBA, significantly slower and quieter. It's 65% PWM. So that was running at 54 degrees. Configuring one top exhaust behind the CPU, one bottom intake below the GPU core, and one side intake near the tower cooler, we operated at 58 degrees over ambient, about 4 degrees warmer than the muted side intake configuration at 40 dBA. Going with full bottom intake was worse for the CPU, as all of the air gets shoved into the GPU, and the only output is warmed air and radiative heat into the tower cooler. Going with 2 bottom intake and 1 top intake proved the worst, a result of a complete lack of any exhaust options outside of some air recirculating and eventually drafting outward. So that's what's going on here. If you're curious, it's because of the way the GPU with an open face cooler has nowhere to send its air because it's relatively close to the glass, close enough that the PCIe cables are in fact touching the glass because it's a plus size PCB. And so what happens is a lot of that air gets stuck in the bottom compartment and some of it eventually drafts up and gets pulled through the CPU. That's why you see the performance we see where these side intakes do the best, because there's a clear path in and out of the case in that it's just a complete positive pressure from the front airflow that forces air out all the cracks it can find, like the bottom of the case for the GPU when it's pushing air out of the cooler. Comparatively, and focusing primarily on 40 dBA testing, the Lian Li O11 Dynamic performed marginally above average with full side intake, testing at 54 degrees Celsius over ambient. This is functionally equal to the Meshify C stock, Darkbase 700, PMO2, and H700i. There's nothing special about this performance metric, aside from the fact that we still have headroom to cool better, of course with louder fans. This point is indicated by the 100% fan speed test, all 48 dBA of it, at 49 degrees Celsius over ambient. Brute forcing doesn't get us to the top of the chart still, despite burning at about 8 dBA over the next grouping of loud cases, but this case is also meant for water cooling. It's when Lian Li ships their air version of the O11 that will focus on air cooling even more, and was originally suggested as shipping with 6 120 fans. We're not sure if that spec stayed though. The case can be made to perform reasonably well for the Dynamic, and that's a pretty strong point for it. For something that is showy and liquid cooling focused, it can still cool really well from an airflow standpoint. You'll just have to add fans carefully and in the right positions. Looking at GPU thermals first against itself, the Lian Li O11 posted a range of 48 to 57 degrees above ambient, with the 3 side intake fans again performing best at 48.1 degrees. The muffled side intake operated next best at 51 degrees, with the 3 bottom intake fans performing shockingly poorly. After further inspection, we realized that this was for 2 reasons. One, there's limited distance between the bottom of the case and the desk, resulting in a heavier requirement for high static pressure and overall reduced access to air. 2, the GPU may take air in, but it's having trouble again pushing the air out with this configuration. The GPU horizontally blocks most airflow upwards as well, so it becomes something of a closed loop that can recirculate air. It's like a firewall. You'd ideally want some exhaust or direct ventilation from elsewhere in the case. Our custom configurations performed worst with the 2 bottom and 1 intake top setup operating at 57 degrees over ambient. Comparatively, the Lian Li O11 Dynamic ends up between the Corsair 570X at 1550 RPM, the View 71, and the venerable Silverstone RL06. Not a bad place to be. This positioning is at 40 dBA for the Lian Li case, which is also roughly the same noise level as the RL06 and the Thermaltake View 37. These three cases are functionally noise normalized and have nearly equivalent performance. Going to 100% fan speed and 48 dBA gets us most of the way to the top, but not quite all the way up there. The case does fine, and it isn't overwhelming in any capacity of the word when configured with 3 well-placed intake fans, but it's doing okay. With the baseline 40 dBA side intake configuration moving on to 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme now, the GPU hit 53 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient in our FSE test. That's again roughly equivalent to the View 37 as well as the H500P mesh. That's among the best scores on our chart for this one, especially for modern cases. Temperatures while rendering with Blender on the CPU mirrored the results of the CPU torture test, 38.3 degrees Celsius, and it's smack in the middle of the chart. Again, liquid cooling or cranking up the fans would improve this number, but this degree of CPU cooling is fine for daily use. GPU accelerated rendering brought the GPU to 25.2 degrees Celsius delta T, putting it in a favorable position between the H700i and the RV02. It's not the best score on the chart, but it's oddly good considering that there's no fan pointed directly into the GPU, as there is in the Half-X, for example. We'd initially pegged the side intake fan slots as a way to show off a fancy radiator, but it seems like they can also do a great job in terms of actual functional cooling. The stock O11 Dynamic, in terms of noise levels now, has no fans, so in a way it's completely silent aside from system noise. That'd put it around where the Inwin 303 is when it has 0 fans. You're just looking at system noise and the ability to contain it, and how well that's done. But we did use 3 fans for the Lian Li review as they supplied them, and these are probably the same fans that'll be used in the Lian Li O11 Air later on. Normally we'd keep fan speeds maxed out for noise tests, but those are at 48 dBA because it's 1900 RPM, which absolutely blows away everything else on the chart other than the PM01. The noise-normalized tests offered decent performance at 40 dBA, which is loud to average for the cases we've tested, depending on how you feel subjectively about that. The O11 Dynamic is different, and that's great. There are tons of manufacturers playing it safe at every price point with samey cases, but Lian Li has avoided falling into that rut, for better or for worse. Performance is much better than we thought it would be, especially for a water cooling case, and the case is well suited for liquid cooling radiators and open loops if that's what you prefer. The vertical GPU mount, typically a weak point for cooling performance, was handled excellently. We're looking forward to the release of the mesh-fronted O11 Air later, which will be better suited for our test bench, and its price we're not final on, but originally at CES what we were told is between $140 and $160. We were also told it'd come with 6 fans, which is a hell of a lot of fans, so we'll see if that holds true. Even with 3 though, it's shaping out to be a really interesting case to test. From a features standpoint, the O11 Dynamic has a lot of cool stuff, just in terms of being well designed, that we don't see on a lot of other modern cases. We can thank probably Der8auer for a lot of that. He's a proper enthusiast, and he frankly isn't someone who designs products all day, so he's not going to be blinded by things like keeping cost down or worrying about MOQ or BOM or any of those other aspects of product manufacturing. He's going to put forward the specs, and then Lian Li will take care of it, hopefully. And it came out really well. So backside has some interesting features that we went over earlier with the cable management bar that's well positioned. It's got 2 power supply mounts, although we don't suspect anyone will really use those for the most part. It's a unique feature. And cooling has enough ventilation options that if you work on it and you put some time into it, you can come out with a really well ventilated system. We would suggest side mounts as intake here. Actually, we thought that would be one of the worst performing ones, but it worked pretty well. And we'll talk about this more with the Air version of the case later. At $130, it's extremely competitive. At the $100 pre-order price, it's an easy purchase. For the build quality, it's superb. You do obviously lack the included fans, but you can make that up easily. And at $100 pre-order, $130 even for the retail price, those are both pretty good price points. A couple of notes for competition. The Thermaltake View 71 that we actually liked a lot more than we thought we would is presently $125 after sales and rebates. That's a really good case for the price at $125. So that's a direct competitor in terms of using it for liquid cooling and price, not for form factor. So keep that in mind. Other alternatives, if you want to look at them in the $150 range, The H500P mesh is roughly near there, depending on what sales are going on. We liked the mesh a lot more than the H500P, and NZXT has a couple of options as well. So that's primarily what we're looking at for immediate competition with the Lian Li O11 Dynamic. As always, subscribe for more. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up one of our mod mats. And the power is going out now. And as noted earlier, we're on a UPS for battery because the electricity is out. Battery's dead, so I'll see you all next time.